Welcome to Scale House. This would have been the venue for the Orkney Science Festival event this evening. So as you're sadly not here, I'll take you in and show you around. Come on through to the dining room and I'll tell you a little bit about Scale House. Well, here we are in the dining room of Scale House. Scale House was built by the Bishop of Orkney, Bishop George Graham, in 1620. And this year would have been our 400th anniversary of the building of the house. He was the Bishop of Orkney from 1615 to 1638. A couple of interesting things in this room. One is the portrait of William Watt, who was the 7th Laird. He discovered Skara Brae in 1850. And he brought all the artifacts. He did the first excavations and brought all the artifacts up to Scale House, and he turned this room actually into a museum. And you had all the artifacts from Skara Brae in this room. The other interesting thing is the Captain Cook's dinner service. Captain Cook's ship, the Resolution, came into Orkney in 1780. They were short of supplies and they sold things off the ship to get food and supplies for them to get to their final destination. And this dinner service was purchased off the ship in return for supplies, which is fascinating to have Captain Cook's plates, which he ate off in the Southern Ocean. After the concert and talk that you have this evening, you would have come down to the dining room and we'd have had a great spread of food on the table here, and tea and sandwiches and wonderful cakes. So I hope you're going to be able to make your own Orkney tea this evening. Right, we're now going to head up to the drawing room where the concert will take place. But on the way, I'll point out a couple of Graham relations who we've got portraits of up here. First is James Graham, Marquis of Montrose. He came into Orkney in 1650 on his way to support Charles II. And I gather when he was executed in Edinburgh, he was chopped up into bits, and bits went to Glasgow and Perth and Stirling, and his head sat on a spike. But eventually all the bits were gathered together again, and he was eventually buried in St Giles in Edinburgh. And secondly, we got John Graham of Claverhouse, who was known as Bonnie Dundee, and he was killed at the Battle of Killiecrankie. So here we are in the drawing room. This would be the venue for tonight's concert. Few things I might point out in here. One is the landscape painted by Stanley Cursiter, who was the Queen's limner, his artist in Scotland. And that's a lovely painting of the cliffs of the island of Stronsay. The other thing is the pictures on the table here. We've got a picture of the Queen Mother, who came to lunch here in 1983 with her signature in the visitors book. So you'll be having the concert in the house where the Queen Mother has visited as well, which I think is wonderful. Thank you for coming to Scale House, and I hope you enjoyed the concert, and we'll look forward to seeing you afterwards for a wonderful Orkney tea.
My love's in Germany, send him hame, send him hame. My love's in Germany, send him hame. My love's in Germany, Langley, land and sea, frae West Tree and fake me. Send him hame, send him hame. My love's in Germany, send him hame. Oh, weary for the war, send him hame, send him hame. That ties my love say rob, send him hame. Where thee hame again, how blithe with thee and rain, but he's roaring on the plain. Send him hame, send him hame. My love's in Germany, send him hame.
When Bishop George Graham began building his home at Scale 400 years ago, Europe was falling into a war that would change the lives of many Orkney men. It would also change the lives of several of the founders of modern science. The bishop had moved north in 1615, when Orkney was recovering from its own eruption of violence, with the siege of Kirkwall Castle and the end of the Stuart Earls. 3 years later, war broke out in Bohemia when its Protestant nobles deposed their Catholic king. They replaced him with Frederick, who ruled the German state called the Palatinate. He was a cultured young man whose capital, Heidelberg, was a home of scholarship. Moreover, he was married to Elizabeth Stuart, daughter of King James VI of Scotland and I of England. But Bohemia was a fatal mistake. He lasted just a year and was called the Winter King. In the year of 1620, while Bishop George Graham was moving into his new house at Scale, Frederick's world was falling apart. On November the 8th, his forces were defeated at the Battle of the White Mountain. Among the observers in the victorious army of the Holy Roman Empire was a young Frenchman called René Descartes. He loved mathematics, but found the philosophy of the time muddled. And so, to seek truth in what people will do when life is at stake, he decided to join the army. At his Jesuit college, he had learned to use a sword and handle a horse. On his way to Bohemia, he was delayed by heavy snow. In an inn in Ulm in Germany, keeping warm by the stove, he had a sudden insight about how to restructure knowledge, to build it piece by piece from established facts, with mathematics, a web linking earth and sky, and that was the basis for modern science. The defeat at the White Mountain forced Frederick and Elizabeth to flee Bohemia so quickly that they almost left their baby son Rupert behind. His nurse forgot about him in the rush, but the last man to leave heard a baby's cries. He grabbed him and wrapped him up and pushed him in through the window of the last carriage. The little boy would be a survivor all his life, coming through wars and imprisonment and storms at sea. He was Prince Rupert of the Rhine. Prince Rupert grew up in Holland, where his parents had found refuge. He loved studying wildlife and art, mathematics and chemical experiments. He spoke several languages, but refused Latin and Greek, saying a soldier did not need them. And when he was just 12, he was off to serve with his great-uncle, the Prince of Orange. By the time he was 18 and 6'4" tall, he was in Germany. The war had swung back and forth several times. Several countries wanted influence in the German states. The Holy Roman Empire had been joined at the outset by Catholic Spain. Denmark, a Protestant state, intervened, but after 5 years was beaten back. But then in came Sweden, whose king, Gustav Adolf, was one of the great commanders of the day. He turned the tide, but was killed in battle in 1632. In that same year, when the Catholic Empire was reeling from the onslaught of the Protestant Swedes, with the Catholic Church itself feeling under threat, Galileo published his support for the Copernican theory that the earth goes round the sun, in contradiction to the Church's teachings. This turned out to be a far from ideal time. The The Catholic forces in Germany had a formidable commander of their own, Count von Wallenstein, and he had a particular interest in astrology. One of the ablest creators of horoscopes was the great mathematician Johann Kepler. At periods in his life when his mathematical skills could not earn him enough to live on, he would apply them to astrology. He carried out a massive analysis of observational data to show that the Earth and the planets do indeed orbit the Sun in elliptical orbits. And that was his contribution, part of his contribution to astronomy. As a Protestant in a Catholic empire, his life was never very settled. And in 1628, Wallenstein took him under his protection as an official advisor. Kepler died in 1630, and the story is that he refused to take Wallenstein's horoscope beyond 1634. And in that same year, Wallenstein, rejected by the emperor for arguing for peace, was assassinated. Some of Wallenstein's descendants live on in Australia today under the name of Wallens. And the late George Wallens, who lived to the age of 100, had all the energy and determination of his ancestor. And despite the Swedish king's death in Germany in 1632, the Swedes continued the war. Catholic France joined them, concerned to keep the balance of power with the empire, and the stories of the Three Musketeers are set in this era. The Danes and Swedes had been recruiting from Scotland. It was a time of harsh winters, the Little Ice Age, when rivers and harbours froze and harvests perished, and a soldier's pay could mean survival for a family. In the north of Scotland, Sir Donald Mackay of Strathnaver raised 3,000 men for the Danish army, and he followed with more for Gustav Adolf in Sweden. We know the names of some of them. Colonel Thomas Trail of Holland in Papua-Estuary went to join the Swedish army about 1630. His nickname of Germany Thomas was remembered in Orkney for the tune of a song he wrote for his wife, My Love's in Germany. He also wrote her a song of farewell on a journey through Flanders, France and Spain, with a promise to love her till all the seas run dry and rocks melt with the sun, a song that was later reshaped by Robert Burns. And from Warbister in Hoy came James King to the wars in Germany. The King family came from Aberdeenshire, where they built Barra Castle. Through his mother, James King was descended from James V. The Stuart Earls in Orkney came from one of the King's mistresses, and James King's grandfather from another. James King joined the Swedish army around 1609. By 1638 he was commanding an army in Germany. Prince Rupert was also there, serving with his older brother, and the two forces linked up. They found themselves under attack from a larger imperial army. Their strategy was defensive, but when they were battled by a formidable force of armoured knights, that was too much for Prince Rupert. He launched his cavalry into action with such fury that the imperial army had to bring in reinforcements. But the prince found that he and his men were isolated, as James King and the prince's brother had retreated, and Prince Rupert was eventually pulled from his horse and captured. James King said afterwards that the prince's impetuosity had cost them the battle. Prince Rupert's version focused on James King's caution, and he had 3 years of imprisonment in which to think about it. He was sent to the castle of Count von Kufstein. They got on so well that the prince was sometimes invited to join the family for dinner, and he fell in love with the count's beautiful daughter. By his 2nd year he was going hunting with neighbouring noblemen, and he also managed to tame a hare that would follow him at heel. Eventually he was simply released, and he was relieved to be free, because he was urgently needed in England, where his uncle, King Charles I, was facing civil war. When the veterans of the wars in Germany came home, they found a new issue to fight about: the role of the king. In England, it was about his powers over Parliament. In Scotland, it was about his ability to control the church by appointing bishops. In February 1638, there was a signing of the Covenant in Scotland, which asserted the independence of the church. In December of that year, the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland expelled bishops, and George Graham of Scale House was among them. Relations with King Charles I broke down into war, and the Scots held their own. When the English Civil War broke out in 1642, many Scots supported Parliament, Alexander Leslie among them. James King, however, backed the royalist cause and was given the title of Lord Athen. Another of the veteran generals, Patrick Ruthven, was appointed commander of King Charles's army. The arrival of Prince Rupert electrified the situation. His cavalry routed the parliamentary army in a series of battles. But Cromwell began to build, and in the summer of 1644 he was joined by a Scottish army. By now York was under siege, and Prince Rupert fought his way north to clear the surrounding forces. But they regrouped, and more reinforcements were coming, and he desperately wanted to attack while he had time. But the royalist troops in York were led by Lord Athen, who arrived late and urged caution. And when the cavalry charge came, it was Cromwell's parliamentarians bursting through driving rain in the gloom of the evening. This defeat at Marston Moor was a turning point. Prince Rupert could see the cause was lost. He urged his uncle, King Charles I, to come to terms with Parliament. But the king seemed unable to change his approach, and the prince went back to Holland. After King Charles I's execution, Prince Rupert was given command of the navy, which was loyal to the future Charles II. There were fights at sea, an exploration of the Gambia River in Africa, an escape from a Caribbean hurricane. He went on to be a founder of the Royal Society, an experimenter and inventor, an artist who developed the technique of mezzotint, and 350 years ago, the first governor of the Hudson's Bay Company in Canada. Prince Rupert had enjoyed art since childhood, when he was given lessons with his sister Louise Hollandine, Louisa for short. She studied with the Dutch painter Gerard van Honthorst, and she became renowned. In 1649, her mother was working for the restoration of the monarchy, and among those planning with her was a handsome Scotsman who had fought brilliantly for the king. This was James Graham, Marquis of Montrose, a cousin of the Grahams of Scale. His portrait can be seen on the stairs at Scale House today. He was an athlete and a poet too, 10 years older than Louisa, but still only 37. Louisa's young sister Sophia wrote down what he had said about his plans. First, he would go to Scotland to establish the young Charles II as king, and then he would ask him, Louisa's cousin, for her hand in marriage. On April the 12th the following year, Montrose landed in Orkney at Roseness in Ham. But it was a changing situation, and the man with the key to it was the Duke of Argyll, the most powerful man in Scotland. It was Argyll who had insisted that King Charles I instruct Montrose to end his earlier campaign of support. Argyll had also negotiated the handover of the king to the parliamentarians. Now he negotiated a new deal with Charles II, for the king to ally himself with the Covenanters and abandon Montrose. Montrose, unaware, was allowed to go ahead, to keep up pressure on Argyll for a deal. Lord Athin, in exile in Sweden, had been appointed Lieutenant General for the expedition, and was expected to lead an army of mercenaries, but he did not appear. A storm at sea sank some of Montrose's ships, with half his army, 1,000 men. He had to make up numbers with young Orkney men who had never fought before, and he was routed at Carbisdale in Sutherland and executed in Edinburgh. Some years later, Louisa took vows as a nun and went to a French abbey and continued to paint. power swung back and forth in Scotland in that century of war. Charles II was restored to power in 1660, but then his son James VII was deposed in favour of the Dutchman William of Orange, a cousin of the family who was married to James's daughter Mary. Among those staying loyal to King James was another cousin of the Grahams of Scale House, whose portrait is also on the stairs. This was James Graham of Claverhouse, the Bonnie Dundee of the song. He rallied the Highland clans for the king and defeated government forces, but died in the victory at Killiecrankie. Through these times of turmoil lived on more of the people who would lay the foundations for modern science. In fact, the man who brought together the work of all of the others, Sir Isaac Newton, was one of them. He was born in the year when the English Civil War broke out, 1642, the same year in which Galileo died. Newton went to Cambridge University in 1661, just a few months after the founding of the Royal Society by King Charles II the previous year. Newton published his great work on gravitation in 1687, 2 years before the Battle of Killiecrankie, and he lived on through the period of William and Mary, and then Queen Anne, and King George, who followed, the nephew of Prince Rupert and his sister Louisa. Newton lived on to 1727, and he has a kind of indirect connection to Scale House. James Irvin's beautifully set out family tree shows that in the year 1773, a brother of William Watt of Breckness, who was a sea captain in Whitby, married a grandniece of Sir Isaac. Newton brought together Descartes' unification of earth and sky by mathematics, which meant that Galileo's discoveries about force and motion down here on the earth could also be applied to the heavens above, and thereby explain the planetary motions analysed by Kepler. So, as Europe emerged from the upheaval of politics and ideas in the 17th century and the long years of terrible destruction in Germany, the years of darkness were replaced by a focus on light, with the old memories slowly passing like an old song.
My love's in Germany, send him home, send him home. My love's in Germany, send him home. My love's in Germany, land leads to land and sea, frae west tree and fade me. Send him home, send him home. My love's in Germany, send him home. Oh, weary for the war, send him home, send him home. That ties my love say rock, send him home. Where thee home again, how blithe would be and rain, but he's roaring up the main. Send him home, send him home. My love's in Germany, send him home. Oh, what somebody say, send him home, send him home. To my soldier far away, send him home. How lonely sighs his mate, counting year and month and day, for all her heart is way. Send him home,